The morning of the wedding arrived in January's cold. The windows of Thornfield glazed with frost that had not yet conceded to the pale sun struggling up behind the elm rows. In the morning room, alone among white roses, she had arranged herself an hour before the household properly woke. Stood a young woman in a plain gray wool gown, her dark hair pinned without ornament, her hands careful and steady among the blooms. She had risen before the maids, because it was her nature to find something useful to do, and because standing still this morning was beyond her. She did not hear the door open behind her. "You there, girl?" Cecily turned. In the doorway stood a woman of 60 who wore her authority the way some women wear diamonds, as a second skin requiring no maintenance. Lady Honoria Ashford, Dowager Countess of Thornfield, was dressed already in gray silk and a quantity of jet that spoke to her opinion of the morning. She looked at Cecily the way one looks at a footstool that has been placed in an inconvenient position. "I require hot water brought to the east wing. Now, if you please. And then you are to tell the bride that I am here and that the ceremony will not be delayed on her account. She has half an hour." A pause, her fan tapping once against her gloved palm. "Do make haste. That boy Henry will be underfoot again, and we cannot have him seen before Mr. Croft has sorted the papers. Go." Cecily did not move. The name settled into the cold air of the morning room like a stone dropped into still water. Henry. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in this house. Not once in the 3 weeks she had been in residence as Edmund's betrothed. Not in the drawing room. Not in the long corridor where Mrs. Partridge walked with her ring of keys. Not in any conversation that touched the edge of the earldom's future. She had wondered. She had noted the locked door on the 3rd floor, the small pair of boots glimpsed once at the turn of the nursery stair, the way Edmund's right hand went, in unguarded moments, to the breast pocket of his coat, as though assuring himself of something small kept there. Henry. The dowager's expression shifted by one precise degree, the way a skilled card player's might when she has played a card she did not intend. "Well," she said, her voice recalibrating without haste. "You are not the girl who brings the water." "No," Cecily said. "I am not." She did not say who she was. She turned back to the roses, her hands as steady as she could make them, and the dowager withdrew. The silence she left behind held the weight of everything Cecily had just been told, without being told. She was, by every measure the season kept, not the sort of woman a man of Edmund's station freely chose. She understood this with the precision of someone who has done the arithmetic many times. Her father had been the Reverend Arthur Vane of Marsh Doling, a gentle scholar who died 3 years past, leaving £40, a modest library, and a debt to his landlord that ate the library within 6 months of the funeral. He had loved her without reservation, and she had loved him in return. And his death had left her in the keeping of an uncle in Norwich who regarded her as a temporary inconvenience of the domestic variety. To the season, she was just a plain little nobody. The words had been Lady Honoria's, whispered to Lady Dorothea Pelham in this very drawing room on the afternoon Cecily arrived at Thornfield. Cecily had not been intended to hear. She had heard clearly. She had straightened her back, smoothed her plain gown, and gone on arranging the books on the shelves as she had been asked. And she had not permitted herself to dwell on it. Because dwelling was a luxury that cost more than she had. She expected very little. She had made herself expect very little. The engagement to Edmund Ashford, the Earl of Thornfield, had been arranged through her uncle's connection to the family solicitor, Mr. Croft, a man of papers and sealed doors who had explained to her in 6 careful sentences that the Earl required a wife of modest means and quiet character for reasons he was not at liberty to specify, and that the arrangement would provide for her materially, and that she was under no obligation, and that she had a week to consider. She had considered for an afternoon. She had said yes. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she felt nothing in particular. She had believed herself. For approximately 4 days. Edmund had met her in the entrance hall on the morning of her arrival, 3 weeks past, standing at the foot of the stair in a navy coat as though he had been there for some time. He was taller than she had anticipated, with dark hair, and the kind of stillness about him that is not ease, but rather the deliberate management of something not at ease. His jaw was set with the faint tension of a man who had been managing things for a long time. He said, "Miss Vane, welcome to Thornfield." His voice was level, low, without performance. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "Come inside. It is too cold to stand in doorways." And he turned and walked, and she followed. And that was, she told herself, the whole of it. It was not the whole of it. She had known that by the second morning. If you are inclined to stay a little longer with this story, I would be glad of your company. There is more here than a name spoken out of turn. She had found her footing at Thornfield in the methodical way she found her footing everywhere, by watching and then by doing. Quietly. What she saw needed doing. She had taken over the correspondence that Mrs. Partridge was too occupied to manage. She had read in the library after dinner because she was not certain whether she was wanted in the drawing room and did not wish to impose. She had walked the grounds in the morning with gloves worn thin at the fingertips and a bonnet she had retrimmed 3 times. On the morning of her 4th day, she had heard it, faintly, from above. A child's voice. The sound of something dropped, a toy or a stool, and then quiet. She had looked up at the 3rd-floor window from the garden and seen nothing. Mrs. Partridge, passing with a basket of pressed linen, had not paused, had not looked up, and the moment had closed over itself like water. Edmund had found her that afternoon in the library. She had been reshelving a stack of volumes that had been stacked wrong by someone in a hurry, ordering them by year of publication in the absence of any other instruction, because order was something she could provide without being asked. He had watched her for a moment from the doorway. She had heard him and had not turned, because turning felt like an invitation she had not decided to extend. "You do not have to do that," he said. "Someone should," she said. "And I have nothing more pressing until dinner." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walk with me. There is a kitchen garden at the back of the east wing that has been let go to seed since the autumn. I want to show you what I intend to do with it in spring." It was not a question. She recognized by now that his commands were never questions and were not unkindnesses. She set down the volume she was holding and went, and they walked the frost-hardened paths for 40 minutes, and he described the kitchen garden with the specificity of a man who had thought about it at some length, and she listened and offered 1 or 2 observations about cold frames and early planting. And when they returned to the house, her face was cold, and her hands were cold, and something in the center of her chest was warm in a way she had not planned for and did not entirely know what to do with. That evening at dinner, he had looked up from his plate at a moment when she happened to be looking at him, and he had not looked away first. And she had felt her pulse at the base of her throat with a sharpness that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. She told herself again that this was practical. She believed herself. For approximately 1 additional day, the days at Thornfield had a particular quality that she had not encountered before, which was the quality of a house that is large enough to leave a person entirely alone, if a person wishes to be left alone, and she took her measure of it slowly. The library ran the full length of the south wing on the first floor, and she had spent the second morning working her way along the shelves with the attentiveness of someone who believes that understanding a person's books is as accurate a portrait as any painted one. Edmund's library was not decorative. The volumes were red, marked with the evidence of having been held and reread and set down and returned to, and the subjects were wide enough in range to suggest a mind that moved in several directions at once. She ran her finger along the spine of a natural history, a treatise on the management of parliamentary estates, 2 volumes of Virgil in the original, and a collected edition of correspondence between a 17th-century naturalist and a Dutch botanist that had been annotated in the margins in a hand she recognized as Edmund's from the letters she had countersigned with him. He wrote in very small, very precise script, the hand of someone who has learned that paper is not limitless. On the morning of the third day, she had found a problem in the household accounts that Mrs. Partridge had been managing with good faith and a small arithmetical error compounding across 6 months. She had sat down with the ledger at the morning room table and worked through it in 2 hours, made a note on a clean sheet, and left the correction on Mrs. Partridge's desk without announcing it. Mrs. Partridge found it, said nothing to her directly, and had since brought her tea in the mornings with a generosity that suggested a certain estimation. Edmund noticed small things. She had begun to understand this on the 4th day, when she reached for her wrap at the end of the library session and found it had been moved from the chair where she had left it to the chair directly by the fire, which was warmer, and no one else had been in the room. On the 5th evening, he had intercepted the footman who was carrying the heaviest of the dinner trays and carried it himself to the sideboard, watching her with the impersonal attentiveness of a man who has catalogued where the difficulty is, and she understood the observation was not about the tray. She did not say thank you. She said, "The ragout is good tonight." And he said, "Mrs. Partridge has a particular hand with it," and the exchange was perfectly ordinary, and the warmth in her chest was not ordinary at all. She told herself for the 3rd time that she was being practical about this. On the 5th morning she had walked the grounds before breakfast in the early light, in the thin-soled boots that were not ideal for frosted grass, and she had come around the corner of the kitchen garden wall to find Edmund there already, his coat without its greatcoat in the cold, studying the dead herb beds with his hands clasped behind his back. He had heard her come around the corner and had not looked up immediately, which she had recognized by now as a form of invitation. She stood beside him. She looked at the beds. "Borage, I think, came from that corner," she said. "The soil is dug differently, and the row against the wall might take sweet peas in spring if the drainage holds. They would be visible from the morning room window." He looked at the corner she had indicated, and then at her. "Sit down," he said, and produced from some coat pocket a folded square of paper that turned out to be a rough sketch of the garden beds, names penciled in the margins. "Tell me what you would do with the eastern row." They sat on the cold stone bench against the wall, the sketch between them, and she told him what she would do with the eastern row. He listened. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. Her breath came out in small clouds in the cold air, and her hands in her thin gloves were growing numb, and she was, inexplicably, entirely at ease in a way she had not been in 3 years. When they rose to go in, he kept a half step behind her until they reached the door, and then he reached past her to open it before she arrived at it, a small thing that required him to stand briefly very close, and she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold of the morning, and the weight of that awareness stayed with her through breakfast and well into the afternoon. It was on the 6th morning that she had found the child's primer. She had come around the corner of the morning room to collect a piece of mending she had left on the low table there, and she had found instead a small figure seated on the hearthrug. perhaps 4 years old, in a nightshirt that had not yet been exchanged for day clothes, bent over a book whose spine was split from having been held too tight in very small hands. The illustrated pages fanned open and several of them torn cleanly from the binding. The child was crying, not loudly, but with the particular silent steadiness of a child who has learned that loud crying does not help. She sat down on the hearthrug without a word. She looked at the book. She found her mending kit in her pocket, as she always carried it. She threaded the needle. It took her 20 minutes, and the child watched with round, dark eyes the whole time, and when she had finished and set the book back in his hands with the pages sound, he looked up at her with an expression that stopped her breath, because it was Edmund's expression exactly. The same dark eyes, the same careful steadiness. And she understood at once what no one had told her. What she did not know was that Edmund had come down the back stair and had stopped at the morning room doorway and had stood there, without moving, for the full 20 minutes. He said nothing afterward. He had been gone when she rose from the hearthrug. At dinner that evening he sat a fraction closer to her than before, and when she reached for the salt, he moved it toward her hand before she had quite arrived at it, and she understood, again, that she was being told something in a language that did not use words. It was not until the portrait gallery that he used words. They had been at Thornfield 12 days by then. The house had settled into evening. The fire in the gallery had been lit for warmth rather than for company, and the paintings on the walls caught the light in the way that old painted faces do, becoming momentarily more present than the living faces in the room. Edmund had asked her, the previous evening at dinner, whether she would allow him to show her the gallery at some point. She had said she would. He had come to find her after supper, with the manner of a man who had decided something and was not going to unmake the decision. He showed her 3 generations of Ashfords, with the economy of a man who finds the paintings useful only insofar as they explain the house. She asked questions when she had them, which was not infrequent. He answered without impatience. They stopped before a small oil in a plain frame, hung between 2 larger and more assertive portraits. A young woman with pale hair and a composed expression, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but possessed of a kind of precision about the eyes. Circa 1814, by the style of the gown. Edmund's right hand went to his breast pocket. He held it there a moment, pressing through the wool. "My wife," he said. "She died in 1815, the autumn after the portrait was painted." Cecily looked at the painting and then at him and said nothing, because sometimes the most accurate thing is silence. "She was a good woman," he said. The word good was not diminishment. He said it the way one says it about something that was genuinely rare. What she died from was the first and worst cost of having been married to me. I have not arranged matters well enough to be forgiven for it, in my own estimation. A pause. "The child," he said, "is Henry. He is 4 years old. He was born 7 weeks after his mother died." His voice did not shift from its level register. He was a man who had practiced steadiness as a discipline. Her family contested the birth. They hold that the marriage was irregular and that the child's claim on the earldom is invalid. The matter is before Mr. Croft, who has the proofs, and whose opinion on the legitimacy is clear. The contest is not settled in law. Not yet. And until it is, every time Henry is seen, known, he is exposed to the machinery of their claim. He turned from the painting, finally, and looked at her. "I have told no one outside this house and this family's legal counsel. Not my mother." She held that in silence for a moment. "He carries your eyes," she said. Something happened to Edmund's face. "Not much. Not any single feature changed. It was more the way a finely calibrated balance shifts when one small weight is added to the lighter side. He reached into his breast pocket and held out his hand, and in his palm lay a small silver button, no larger than a halfpenny, the kind that fastens a christening coat. "I was not present when he was christened," he said. "I had been called to London on the family's legal business, trying to prevent the challenge before it could be formally lodged. When I returned, his mother had been dead 6 days." A pause. "The button was given to me by Mrs. Partridge, who kept everything that could be kept." He closed his fingers around it. "I carry it." She did not say that she was sorry, because he had not asked for sorrow. She said after a moment, "He will need to be presented, eventually. Named to the world." "When Croft's brief is secure," Edmund said. "When the challenge has no remaining toehold." "And the new marriage," she said carefully. He looked at her. "A wife of modest means and quiet character," she said, keeping her voice level, "who will not ask questions that cannot yet be answered." He was quiet for a long moment. "I had intended," he said, "to ask you those questions, properly, at some point." He put the button back in his pocket. "I find I have done this rather badly." "You have done it honestly," she said. "That is not badly." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not name, but which settled into her chest like warmth settling into a cold room, slowly, from the inside out. He said, "Good night, Miss Vane." And he left the gallery. And she stood before the portrait of his wife for a while longer. And the fire in the grate talked to itself, and she put her hand over her heart and felt it moving. The dinner at Hartley Hall, 4 days before the wedding, was managed by the Dowager with the efficiency of a general deploying troops she trusted, which did not include Cecily. Lady Dorothea Pelham attended in ice blue silk with the deportment of someone who had been told, since the age of 12, that she was the obvious correct answer to any question. Lady Pelham's mother, seated 2 chairs from Cecily on the left, leaned toward her neighbor during the 4th course, and said, in the carrying undertone of a woman who does not genuinely worry about being overheard, that it was very puzzling what Thornfield was about, saddling himself with a plain little nobody when the obvious arrangement was there for the asking. Cecily heard it. She looked at her plate. She ate 2 more spoons of the ragout, because the ragout was well prepared, and she had not eaten well enough that morning, and wasting food because of a careless woman's careless remark was not something she was willing to do. Edmund across the table said nothing. His jaw was a fraction tighter than it had been. His gaze did not seek hers. She told herself that was reasonable. She told herself a great many things, steadily. For the remainder of the evening, the drawing room after dinner held perhaps 20 guests, arranged in the configurations that dinner parties always produce. The older ladies settled near the fire with their cards, the younger women distributed at the piano and the windows, the gentlemen who had followed the port with more than was advisable, positioned at the sideboard with the self-satisfaction of men in possession of a good bottle. Lady Honoria moved through the room with the fluency of long practice. A word here, a gesture there, her path never accidental, and her arrivals always purposeful. Cecily watched her do it with a kind of neutral professional respect. It was skilled work, social management at that level. One had to grant it. Lady Dorothea was at the piano, not playing, but standing near it in a way that suggested she might play at any moment, and that this possibility was itself a kind of performance. She was, in her ice-blue gown in the candlelight, very composed, and very polished, and very precisely what the Dowager had intended for this house. She looked once at Cecily across the room with an expression that was not precisely unkind. It was the expression of someone who is assessing a situation accurately and finding it confusing, which was, Cecily thought, a more honest response than contempt. Edmund appeared at her right shoulder at 9:15, which she had not heard and had not anticipated, and said, "Miss Vane," in the tone he used for the commands that were not unkindnesses, and she turned, and he offered her a glass of ratafia that she had not asked for, and which she did not particularly want, but which had the effect of giving her something to do with her hands, and he stood beside her for the next 20 minutes without saying a great deal more, and the effect of having him there was that no one addressed the matter of the plain, little nobody to her face for the remainder of the evening. She did not know whether it had been deliberate. She suspected it had been deliberate. She thought about the kitchen garden bench and the sketch and the door held open in the cold morning, and she thought she should stop telling herself things that were not quite true. She did not quite manage to stop. She began, though, to find it a less convincing project than it had been at the start of the week. The morning before the wedding, Mrs. Partridge came to Cecily's room with a cup of tea and a face that carried news she had not chosen to carry. "I am to tell you," the housekeeper said, setting the cup on the nightstand with the care of someone who is managing more than the cup, "that I heard her ladyship speaking to Mr. Croft in the East Passage this morning, about the ceremony." A pause. She said, in her own words, that the proceedings would be easier all around if his lordship applied some common sense and left off importing plain little nobodies into a house that already had a perfectly capable contender for the Countess's position. Cecily looked at the cup. Mr. Croft said nothing in reply. He said, "My lady," in the way that means he is waiting for her to finish. Cecily drank the tea. It was good tea, brought up from the best caddy, and she was grateful to Mrs. Partridge for it. She did not see Edmund that morning. He was in the study with Mr. Croft from 7 o'clock, and the study door was closed. She walked the kitchen garden instead, in the thin winter light, and she thought about the plain, cold arithmetic of the thing. The Dowager had the leverage she had always had. The name of a child no one was supposed to know about. If she spoke it aloud, if she named Henry publicly, in company, where the wrong ears might carry it back to the wrong people, she would expose the boy to precisely the legal jeopardy Edmund had spent 4 years preventing. The threat did not need to be spoken directly. The Dowager had merely to suggest to Mr. Croft that the wedding was inadvisable, and to imply that her discretion about certain domestic matters was conditional on the arrangement being reconsidered. She thought Edmund would go quiet. He will go very still and very quiet, the way he does when he is holding something in both hands that he cannot afford to drop, and she will think he is choosing her. She will think she was right all along. She was not going to stand in this garden in worn gloves and determine what a man would or would not do before he had the chance to do it. She went inside. Edmund did not appear at breakfast. He was in the study when she passed its door at 9:30, and she heard, faintly, the low sound of voices, his and Mr. Croft's, the kind of exchange that requires closing doors. She went to the library. She did not attempt to read. She looked out the window at the kitchen garden where the dead herb beds were waiting for spring, and she thought about Henry's eyes, which were Edmund's eyes, which were the eyes of a child who had grown up in a house with a locked door on the 3rd floor because someone else's confidence in the social order required it, and she found that she was not afraid. She was something else. She was patient, in the way that people who have learned that action from composure carries further than action from panic are patient. Mrs. Partridge came to the library at 11 with a cup of tea, and the information, delivered without preamble, that the study door was still closed and that the carriage was not ordered, which she offered as a piece of intelligence she thought Cecily might find useful, and which Cecily did find useful. and which she thanked Mrs. Partridge for with a specificity that made the older woman nod twice and leave without further comment. She dressed for the ceremony at 10:30. She had one good gown, white muslin with a low sash, and a Spencer jacket in cream wool that she had purchased at some cost in Norwich, in the weeks after her uncle had informed her of the arrangement, because she was not going to be married in anything she was ashamed of. She had repressed it 3 times in the preceding days. It was not the rival's ice blue silk. It was hers. And it was clean. And it was honest. And those were the properties that mattered. She did not see Edmund before the ceremony. She did not seek him out. She pinned her hair herself, in the small glass in the room she had occupied for 3 weeks. And she looked at her own reflection for a moment with the cool attention of someone taking inventory. And she said to herself, without irony, that this was who she was, and that it had been enough before, and it would be enough now. She went downstairs. The ceremony was held in the great hall at Thornfield at 11 o'clock. The guests arranged in 2 rows of chairs on either side of the aisle that had been laid with white cloth over the stone flags. The vicar had come from the village, a practical man who performed these offices without sentiment, but with precision. The candles were lit along the walls. The morning light came through the long windows at the hall's west end and struck the white cloth at a low winter angle that made the room look, for a moment, very old and very sure of itself. Edmund stood at the hall's far end, beside the vicar, in his navy coat with the white cravat. He had not looked at Cecily since she entered, which she had noted, and which she was managing. She walked the aisle without a companion on her arm. She had no one to provide one, and she had decided that morning that she did not require the affectation of one in any case. She had reached the 3rd row of chairs when the Dowager Countess of Thornfield rose from her seat on the right-hand side. "I am afraid," said Lady Honoria Ashford, in the carrying voice she used for public declarations, "that I cannot allow this to continue." The room went perfectly still. "My son has entered into this arrangement under some considerable misapprehension as to what this family requires, and I am prepared to explain, before this company and before Mr. Croft, who is present for this occasion, precisely why a revision is necessary." She lifted her chin. "The child known as Henry, whom my son has concealed in this house these 4 years, is an illegitimate pretender to the Thornfield earldom, whose claim has been formally contested by the family of the mother, and whose existence, when made public, will bring the entire succession into dispute. My son is choosing this nobody over the security of this house, and I will not, madam." Edmund had not raised his voice. He had not moved except to take one step toward the assembled company, and the single word landed in the room with the weight of something that had been decided before this moment and would not be revised. His mother stopped. "Mr. Croft," Edmund said. Mr. Croft, a spare gray man who had been seated with his documents at a small table to the left of the aisle, rose without haste and opened a leather satchel. The legal brief confirming the legitimate birth of Henry Arthur Ashford, christened on the 7th of March, 1815, and the formal withdrawal of the Pemberton family's challenge, dated the 29th of December last, are in my possession and may be examined by any person in this room. Mr. Croft held the papers with the expression of a man who has waited some years to do exactly this. The challenge was withdrawn 5 days ago, upon receipt of the original marriage certificate and the midwife's attestation, both of which my office had obtained from Somerset House. The earldom of Thornfield has a clear and legitimate heir. A murmur moved through the room like a current. Edmund turned to Cecily. She was standing in the aisle, 3 rows from the front, and she had not moved. He crossed the distance between them at a measured pace that nevertheless felt to the assembled company like a decision made in every one of its steps, and he stopped in front of her. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the portrait gallery, the way that was not an examination, but a recognition. "She is the Countess of Thornfield," he said to the room without raising his voice and without turning from her. "Henry's mother. My choice." The room held its breath. Edmund's mother sat in her chair with the stillness of a woman who is doing the arithmetic at speed. The Dowager had spent 35 years knowing how to read a room, and what she was reading now was a room that had already decided and was in the process of saying so, without words. The murmur that moved through the assembled guests was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It was the sound of 22 people revising their understanding of a situation simultaneously, and the current it produced was unmistakable. Mr. Croft held the papers with a steadiness that came from having waited 5 days to hold them in this room, in this company. He did not speak again. He had said what was required. The documents were dated, witnessed, and clear, and the legal challenge had been withdrawn in writing by the Pemberton family's own solicitor, who had had the good sense to recognize the midwife's attestation as unimpeachable. Mr. Croft had, over 4 years, handled 14 pieces of correspondence relating to Henry's legitimacy, and had not enjoyed a single one of them. He allowed himself now to look at the documents with the private satisfaction of a man who has done a difficult thing correctly. The vicar opened his book. Lady Dorothea rose with her mother and walked quietly toward the door. She did not look back. Her expression, in the moment she passed Cecily, was not cruelty, but something closer to accurate assessment, the expression of a woman who has conceded a point to reality and is recalibrating with the efficiency of someone who has other resources. The candles along the walls burned evenly in the still air of the hall. The frost on the tall windows was beginning to recede in the morning's light. Edmund offered his arm. Cecily took it. Her hand was steady. They stood before the vicar, and they were married. The crowd's witnessed recognition settled over the room in the way that significant things settle, not in applause or exclamation, but in a collective held breath released, in a murmur that named itself satisfaction, in the way Mrs. Partridge, standing in the doorway to the servants' passage at the hall's far end, pressed her free hand flat against the doorframe and closed her eyes for one moment. 2 elderly gentlemen from the county, men who had known the Ashford family for 40 years, exchanged a glance of a kind that requires no words. A young woman near the window, the daughter of a neighboring estate, reached for her mother's hand. The Dowager had not left her chair. She sat with a composure that was costing her something, and Cecily could see, in the set of her shoulders, the moment the calculation completed. The boy was legitimate. The papers were in order. The marriage was performed. The room had witnessed. There was no lever remaining. Whatever scene she had arranged in her mind for this morning had run into a fact that no amount of social authority could revise, and she was, at her core, a woman who understood facts. She was not destroyed by it. She would not be destroyed by it. She was, for the first time that Cecily had observed, entirely still, and the stillness was not authority. It was the pause of a woman who had reached the edge of her script and found nothing written on the other side. The formalities were attended to with the care they required. Mr. Croft witnessed. The vicar recorded. The documents Edmund signed carried the name of his wife for the first time in any public instrument, and he signed them steadily. After the ceremony, when the guests had been received in the drawing-room and the house had opened its better bottles, and Mrs. Partridge had produced a cold collation of considerable excellence from what were, she explained afterward, supplies she had been quietly laying in for a week, Edmund found a moment to stand beside Cecily near the window that overlooked the kitchen garden. The guests were occupied. Mrs. Partridge was circulating with practiced efficiency. The Dowager had retired to the east sitting room with a cup of tea and the deportment of someone who is choosing the terms of her own withdrawal. Edmund said, in a low voice, "I owe you an explanation for this morning." She looked at the kitchen garden, where the frosted beds were receiving the first real sun of the day. "You were in the study with Mr. Croft from 7 o'clock, she said, "working out what I had heard in the passage and how it would be managed at the ceremony." A pause. "You knew what she had said to Croft?" "Mrs. Partridge," Cecily said. "She thought I should know." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I had considered telling you the night before. I decided that what you did not need was one more person asking you to carry a weight before it was necessary." He looked at the garden. "That was not necessarily the correct judgment. It was not wrong," she said. "I had the morning to myself, and I used it well." He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and something that had been held at a careful distance between them, across 3 weeks of kitchen gardens and library shelves and evening ragout closed, not suddenly, but with the inevitability of something that has been approaching for some time. "Cecily," he said. The first time he had used her given name, he said it the way he said everything, level and without performance, and it landed in the room with the weight of a considerable decision. "I am sorry that this has been less straightforward than you deserved." "Edmund," she said. She had not used his name before either. He was still for a moment at the sound of it. "Straightforward things are rarely worth having. You told me that honestly, in the gallery, when you did not have to. Henry exists, and he is healthy, and he is legitimate, and the morning's work is done." She looked at the kitchen garden. "The barrage corner wants attention in February. I should like to plan it properly." He said, "Yes." And there was more in that single word than she was entirely prepared for, and she felt the warmth of it move through her chest like a thing that had decided to stay. In the days that followed, the household settled into itself. The Challenges' withdrawal, once the news was generally in possession of the county, produced the particular kind of social recalibration that has always attended the correction of a hierarchy's misjudgment. The families who had deferred to the Dowager Countess's assessment of the match revised their assessments with varying degrees of grace. Lady Honoria herself was not destroyed by the morning's events. She was a woman of too much intelligence and too much invested dignity to accept destruction. She withdrew to her own establishment in Bath at the end of the week, with the precision of a general who has conceded a battle, but not a campaign, and who has enough wit to know when further engagement costs more than it earns. She and Cecily did not speak again before she left. They would, in time, reach a kind of functional understanding. The Dowager was not a villain, precisely. She was a woman whose entire map of the world had been drawn by one set of instruments, and she had not known, until now, that there existed a different kind of accuracy. Mr. Croft departed Thornfield on the second morning after the wedding with his papers in order, and the ease of a man who has finally placed a stone he has been carrying for some time. He shook Edmund's hand, bowed to Cecily, and said, "My lady," and the title settled around her shoulders with a weight she had not anticipated and a warmth she had not permitted herself to expect. On the third day after the ceremony, Edmund brought Henry down the main stair for the first time. The child descended with great seriousness, one hand in his father's and the other holding the repaired primer, whose pages held. He looked at Cecily from the last step with dark, steady eyes. "Mrs. Partridge says you are my mother now," he said, with the directness of a child who has decided that the direct approach is most efficient. Edmund looked at Cecily over the child's head with an expression she understood. which was the expression of a man who has stopped holding something tightly because he has someone to set it down with. "If that suits you," Cecily said to Henry. Henry considered this for a moment with the gravity of 4 years old. Then he held out the primer. "There is a horse on page 11, he said. "I should like you to read it." She took the primer from him, and she sat down on the bottom step, which was not the conventional location for a Countess of Thornfield, and she opened to page 11. The drawing room, visible through the open door, was warm with firelight. The January afternoon had pulled back from the windows and was settling into early dark, and the candles had been lit along the mantelpiece, and the smell of the fire was the smell of a house that has been waiting, patiently, for the people inside it to find their way to a particular evening. Mrs. Partridge came down the corridor with a tea tray, saw what she saw, and turned away again without a word. Some things do not require attendance. Edmund stood at the foot of the stair and watched his son lean against his wife's arm while she read, and he put his right hand into his breast pocket and pressed the small silver button between his fingers, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The page turned. Henry pointed at the horse with one small, precise finger. The fire held its warmth. The evening settled around them like the answer to a question that had been asked very carefully and very quietly for a long time. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's morning found its way to you, leave a word below, and it will find its way back.